This is Chapter 11 of Learning Web Design, which kicks off the CSS portion of the textbook. In the next several chapters, we'll learn how CSS is used to style HTML pages. For most of the first decade of the web, HTML was used for both content and presentation. However, as anyone who has ever dealt with an even moderately complex page from that era knows, asking HTML to do dual duty in this way was just not sustainable. Pages became brittle, with even the smallest changes sometimes causing the page to shatter into disconnected pieces. It also made the page design, which until the advent of CSS was primarily a programmer's job, somewhat inscrutable to graphic designers and other professionals without a computer science degree. The solution was CSS, which provided many improvements over the old way of doing things. It allowed greater control over the look and feel of the page. In the process, it also made the look and feel portable from one website to another. This pluggability in turn allowed more variety in the way pages could be displayed. While it took a few years for designers and browser vendors to realize all these benefits, HTML and CSS are now the standard way of building web pages, with wide support in all modern browsers on the market. When talking about a visual art form, it's best to show rather than to tell. So, in that spirit, here's what happens when a well-structured and semantically correct HTML page is combined with a rich set of CSS styling rules. The HTML itself is pretty easy to follow, devoting the bulk of its space to content and organization. Meanwhile, the rendered page is both correct and easy to scan with your eye. It looks pretty nice too. The book pays homage to the CSS Zen Garden website, which was designed to illustrate the visual power of CSS. The site provides a standard HTML page that contains nothing but text content. To this, the designer can add a theme in the form of a CSS style sheet and perhaps a few decorative images. The result is whatever the designer wants it to be, with an almost endless variety of possible styles. The site is truly a wonder, especially given how long ago it launched. By itself, it probably altered more people's thinking about CSS than just about anything else out there. Here we see 3 different themes, none of which look remotely like the others. Even the location of the menus and content are different from one page to the next. However, if we look really carefully at the actual text content, everything here is the same. And of course, the HTML markup itself is absolutely identical. The process of designing a website with style sheets is pretty much what you'd expect. Start with a clean HTML document with semantic markup. Often just the minimal markup is enough, but sometimes we have to add some divs or span elements to make it easier to style. Divs and spans do not have any semantic meaning of their own, so they at least don't confuse people with unintended meanings. Then add style rules that specify what the page element should look like. Obviously, this is where CSS comes into play and can be quite complex sometimes. Lastly, the rules are attached to the document through various means. Actually, there is an unmentioned 4th step. Often you have to edit the HTML and CSS again to make them work together. Debugging is always part of the process. The syntax for CSS rules is fairly terse, with a minimum of grammatical decoration. The first part is the selector clause, which indicates which elements are affected by the rule. The selector syntax is very rich, allowing the designer lots of control over exactly which elements are selected. We will cover the manifold ways to craft a selector as we need them in the chapters that come. For now, we'll just stick with the simplest case, where the selector lists the names of the elements that apply. The other half of the rule is the declaration block, which sets the values of properties for the selected elements. The format of each declaration is property:value, with a semicolon after the value. Finally, for numerical values, for sizes and similar quantities, the unit of measurement immediately follows the number. In the case shown here, the font size is being specified relative to the size of the default font. One easy way to keep selectors and declarations straight is to think of the rule as an elaborate if-then statement. The selector is the if part, and the declaration block is the then part. Here on the left, the rule can be read as, if the element is an H1, then set the text color to orange and set the typeface to Arial. The curly brackets and the rest are really just a very terse way of stating this if-then rule to the browser. Once the rules have been defined, there are three different ways to attach them to the HTML. The external style sheet method uses a separate CSS file that's linked in the head of the HTML file. The second way, the embedded style sheet method, uses a style element in the HTML itself. Like the external style sheet link, the style element typically goes in the head of the HTML document. The last way, with inline styles, uses the style attribute found in all visible HTML elements. An inline style rule only applies to a single element, the one whose style attribute is being set, and just includes the declaration block without the selector part of the rule. So, the main difference between the three techniques is the scope of the rule. An external style sheet can apply to multiple pages, while the embedded style sheet is narrower, only applying to elements within a given HTML file. The narrowest scope is an inline style, which only applies to a single HTML element in a single HTML file. With these preliminaries out of the way, the book proceeds to four big concepts, more like three big concepts and one sort of big one, that everyone needs to know to write CSS rules. The first, inheritance, can be used to cut down significantly on the number of rules one has to write to style a page. The second is cascading, which allows rules to be combined from multiple sources. The third is the CSS box model, which governs a lot of what we can do to lay out elements on the page. The last, group selectors, is more like an example of the richness of CSS than a big concept in and of itself. Group selectors are how one rule can apply to elements of different types. We'll see other kinds of selectors in the chapters that follow. Rule inheritance is derived from the HTML document tree we discussed in Chapter 5. And the tree container elements act as parents to the child elements inside them. Sometimes we can apply a rule to the parent, and it will also apply to all of the children, and their children, and so forth. By eliminating the need to apply a rule explicitly to the children, we save on writing lots of redundant rules. However, some properties can't be inherited, so you might want to bookmark a good CSS reference to be sure the next time you try to use inheritance in this way. The book does a pretty good job of explaining inheritance. Here we see the tree for the 20s.html file discussed throughout the chapter. It's got plenty of parent elements like this one, with children below them. There are also examples here of sibling elements that share a parent. As we'll see in Chapter 12, we can actually select elements based on who their parents or siblings are. The effect is a lot like how relative URLs can be used instead of absolute URLs to pinpoint a resource with a minimum of effort. Here we see a style rule being applied to all paragraphs. The rule sets the font size and typeface. Since both of these properties are inheritable, they also apply to any child elements that have text properties. Note that the rule is not inherited by the image element because images don't have text properties. Cascading is how CSS rules from multiple sources can be combined. The name cascade comes from how each source overrides the ones that precede it. The browser comes with some stock default settings for things like font size, line spacing, etc. These can then be overridden by custom style sheets that users might have if, for example, they're visually impaired and require larger text sizes. Next are any external style sheets, then embedded style sheets, and finally any inline styles. One source does not replace the previous ones wholesale. Rather, think of it as the overall set of rules being extended with each source in the cascade, overriding only some of what was previously declared but keeping what it can. In other words, each source can only augment and refine the rules in play at the time it is loaded, but never actually reduces the number of rules. The book has a more formal definition that covers all the possibilities. We'll get to the ones at the bottom of the hierarchy in a minute or two. When cascading gets complicated, it's when multiple conflicting rules apply to the same element. We can't, for example, show a bit of text in both blue and red at the same time. CSS cascading resolves these conflicts with three basic laws: rule order, specificity, and importance, stated here in increasing priority. We'll cover them in turn. The rule order law is how we expect cascading to work. Rules are applied in the order they are loaded according to the style sheet hierarchy. With each rule, the browser sets the properties as requested, the effect being that the last declaration for a given property always wins, overriding the ones that precede it. However, there is an exception that takes higher priority. Regardless of the order the rules appear in the style sheets, the most specific selector always wins out. Here we see that the first rule, which selects just the H1 elements that have the ID set to page title, is more specific than the second rule that applies more generally to all H1 elements. We'll dive into how specificity works in Chapter 12. But even this law has an important exception. If two rules have the same specificity, then there is one final tiebreaker we can use to resolve the conflict. In order to let rules in places like user style sheets required for accessibility reasons win out over more specific rules loaded later in the cascade, CSS allows us to mark a declaration as important, preventing it from being overridden. Again, importance applies to declarations, not selectors. This allows us to mark some of the declarations in a rule as important, while letting the others be overridden. The third big idea is the CSS box model. In CSS, every element has a configurable amount of white space surrounding it. The white space always has a rectangular shape. It's invisible to the user, but nonetheless affects how elements are laid out on the page. We've already used the Web Developer extension in Chrome to highlight the boxes around the block elements. The book uses a somewhat clumsier technique that alters the CSS. We'd rather not do that. We might forget to unhighlight the boxes when we're done, leaving the user to wonder what all the colored boxes are for. Chapter 14 is entirely devoted to the box model, so we'll leave the details for then. The last, sort of big idea is the use of group selectors. Group selectors combine several smaller sections into a comma-separated list. If any of the selectors on the list match the element, then the rule is applied. As a mental trick to remember what the commas represent, just think of each one as representing OR, making the example shown say something like, if the element is an H1, or an H2, or a P, or an image, then set the border around its box to a 1-pixel solid blue line. This brings us to the end of the chapter. Thank you for following along with Chapter 11 of Learning Web Design. See you later.